The scene cuts sharply to the shadow dungeon, the oppressive darkness broken only by the faintest glimmer of red as Amit stood with his arms crossed, an unmistakable irritation lacing his voice. "Hey you, bug!" he snapped, his tone a cold slap in the silence. "Flying around in circles won't bring back the young monarch, so why don't you calm down a bit?" His words dripped with exasperation, but Baru, frantic and restless, was a blur of motion as he zipped through the air, his wings beating the air in an erratic frenzy. His eyes were wide, a storm of anxiety and fear swirling behind them, and as his voice cracked, the desperation within him was undeniable. "You cold-blooded reptile!" he barked, the words trembling with the weight of his worry. "How can you tell me to calm down when we have no idea how the young monarch is faring right now?" His voice broke, a tremor of helplessness creeping in as tears welled in his eyes. "Young monarch." Baru can't even sleep from the concern. Essel, standing beside Amit, lowered her head, her gaze clouded with unease. She understood Baru's anxiety all too well, and her voice reflected it. "I get why Baru is acting like this," she murmured, her tone heavy. "It's already been 2 weeks since the young monarch entered the gate." Her words hung in the air, thick with a quiet dread that neither could ignore. Amit, unmoved, simply tightened his arms across his chest, his voice as cold as stone. "So you're worried too?" His gaze was steady, unflinching, as if the weight of his words meant nothing in the face of the larger picture. Essel's eyes narrowed, a spark of irritation flickering in them. She shot him a glare, her words laced with a sharpness that matched her gaze. "Aren't you being too heartless? You're a companion just like us." Her voice dropped, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of betrayal. Amit's eyes softened just slightly, though his tone remained unyielding, as if set in stone. "I understand your worry, but tell me," he began, his voice carrying the gravity of experience. "Are you even really looking at the young monarch?" His words landed like a heavy blow, the room stifling with silence as he continued. "I know you view him as just a child compared to the vast power of the Shadow Monarch. But I've never met the Shadow Monarch." His gaze shifted upward, his thoughts briefly returning to the memories of Suho's relentless training, those grueling days that shaped the young monarch into what he was today. "I've only seen Suho," he said, his voice carrying a quiet pride. "The one who never once uttered a word of surrender, even when his bones were shattered, his flesh torn, and his mind pushed beyond its limits." Amit's eyes hardened with determination, the weight of his certainty in every word. "No matter what trials he faces, he will come out safe." Essel and Burra stood silent, a quiet understanding settling between them. Amit's words offered a fragile flicker of hope, a reminder that belief in the young monarch was their only anchor in the storm. Essel let out a soft, relieved sigh, her lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Well, you're not wrong. All we can do is believe in the young monarch." The scene shifted, the cold, tense atmosphere of the shadow dungeon giving way to the chaos of the class change quest. Suho, pulse racing and heart pounding, surged forward with fists clenched in unrelenting focus, his eyes locked on his target, Tutorial Suho. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut, as Suho growled, a low, guttural sound that echoed with defiance. "Do you think I'll just keep dying to you?" The words dripped with anger, his fists propelled forward with a ferocity that could shatter mountains. But just as his punch neared its mark, Tutorial Suho moved with a speed that bordered on mockery, casually lifting a hand to intercept the blow. The force of his counter was overwhelming, an effortless strength that obliterated Suho's form in an instant, his body crumbling into countless shattered pieces as though he were nothing more than glass. The scene flicked, shifting in a heartbeat, and Suho found himself respawning, only to face a new, even more harrowing challenge, Baby Suho. His heart hammered in his chest, the surge of determination almost palpable as he leapt into the air, poised for another strike. This time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Confidence coursed through him like a torrent. This time, he would land the blow. But just as he was about to make contact, Baby Suho raised his hand. A ripple of power surged through the air, and with the crushing weight of the ruler's authority, Baby Suho's telekinetic force slammed into Suho. Time seemed to slow as Suho was crushed midair, the sickening crack of bones breaking in a symphony of agony. His body crumpled under the weight, the pain too excruciating to comprehend. As he lay dying once again, Suho's mind twisted in agony, the unbearable weight of his circumstances sinking in. "I gave up long ago on counting how many times I've died." But even in the midst of his suffering, something strange began to take root in his mind. He began seeing their status windows. The baby version of him, the one with the unholy power to tear apart the very fabric of reality with a thought, had no player level, but his ruler's authority was maxed out. Then there was the tutorial version, the monster, level 99 Soul Striker, capable of obliterating anything with a touch, a true force of nature. Suho couldn't help but let out a breath of bitter amusement. A true monster. A thick, suffocating sense of dread pressed down on Suho, but with it came an unsettling realization. No matter how many times he died, no matter how many times his body was broken and torn apart, he was learning. Each death, every agonizing moment, was chiseling away at the fear that once paralyzed him. Shaking off the remnants of his grim thoughts, Suho snapped back to the present. He sprang to his feet with urgency, his muscles protesting the motion, but his resolve was ironclad. He couldn't waste a second. The dungeon stretched out before him like an endless maze, but Suho was determined to find a way out, or at least uncover something new. As his feet pounded against the cold stone floor, he thought to himself, "I didn't get far enough to mark it on the map." The thought gnawed at him, a reminder of his failure to make meaningful progress. Fighting both versions of himself over and over again, Suho began to feel the creeping familiarity of his own fear. "I'm slowly getting used to it, I guess," he mused, his thoughts tinged with grim determination. With every death, something shifted within him. One time, during a brutal clash, his gut had been violently torn open, his insides spilling out, but all Suho could think was, "Damn it, I'll have to go for the next." Another time, he'd come so close to baby Suho he could almost touch him, but the infant's telekinetic power had crushed him before he could act. "I got closer to you this time, you hear me?" he thought, the defiance in his mind a flickering flame against the darkness. But no matter how many times he died, no matter how many ways he perished, something changed inside him. Something was progressing. This feeling should only matter in here, he realized, his thoughts clear despite the chaos of his surroundings. I know I can't take death lightly. I have to fight. I have to survive. No matter the cost. No matter how many deaths it takes. Each challenge was another step forward, another layer of resilience added to his soul. At the respawn point, Suho bent over the map, his blood staining it as he updated it with a grim focus. In the midst of all that, he thought inwardly, I felt myself starting to become more resilient. The map was filled with chaos and uncertainty, but there, in the middle, was a blank space, a part of the dungeon he hadn't yet explored. His finger hovered over it, and with a thoughtful tone, he muttered to himself, "Seems like that's the only place I haven't gone so far." With a sharp inhale, Suho's voice hardened with determination. "If there's no exit there," he muttered, "it means there's no way of finishing the class change quest aside from defeating those two." His eyes burned with a new intensity, a fire stoked by his countless trials. Come to think of it, he thought with a frown, it's strange. I've been running into those two much faster than before. And then it happened. A smirk crept across Suho's face as his eyes narrowed. Just look at this, he thought, a dark amusement curling at the edges of his mind. Here he is again. The baby version of him appeared before him once more, floating serenely in the air, surrounded by his toys like an unsettling puppet master. Suho took in the sight, his eyes sharp, his mind working quickly. It looks like he's trying to stop me from going this way. But Suho had already made up his mind. He'd died too many times, suffered too much to give up now. The thought of retreating was nothing more than a fleeting notion. He charged forward, his body moving with the raw urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose. The ruler's authority uses an invisible hand, he thought quickly. If I surround myself with it as well, will it work as a shield? Drawing on every shred of his willpower, Suho summoned the ruler's authority, surrounding himself with the invisible power. As he closed the distance between him and baby Suho, he felt the clash. His ruler's authority met the baby's in a fierce confrontation. It was a clash of wills, an invisible battle for control. And in that brief moment, Suho saw the raw potential of his power against the infant's overwhelming force. Not wasting a second, Suho darted to the side, narrowly evading a deadly strike that whooshed past him by the thinnest margin. Seizing the opening, he launched himself into the air, soaring over the baby's head, avoiding a direct confrontation. Baby Suho, clearly annoyed by the move, pivoted quickly, his eyes narrowing in irritation. Before he could summon another attack, whether it be with his ruler's authority or his floating toys, Suho acted. With a swift motion, he threw his jacket at the baby. The fabric flew through the air, landing squarely on baby Suho's face, momentarily blinding him and giving Suho the precious seconds he needed to escape. Without hesitation, Suho tore off in the direction of his goal, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. As he raced through the hallways, his eyes suddenly widened in surprise. There, ahead of him, was the passage he had been searching for, the one place he hadn't yet explored. His heart surged with excitement as he thought, "Yes, that's the left passage. The only place I haven't gone so far." Every step felt like a victory, a step closer to the end of this relentless nightmare. Suho sprinted toward the passage, his heart pounding in his chest with a fierce hope. "Please let there be something different here." He silently prayed, his every step carrying the weight of his desperation. And as though the universe had heard his plea, there it was, a gate. A third gate, hidden deep within the dungeon, the very one he had been searching for all this time. For a moment, Suho was frozen in disbelief, his eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat as he stared at the gate, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips, a surge of victory rushing through him. "Just as I thought," he thought. There was another being besides those two. But as the thrill of discovery flickered inside him, a sense of dread began to creep into his chest. Something wasn't right. He could feel it, a cold, foreboding presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The Soul Striker. He could sense him heading toward him with terrifying speed. Suho muttered under his breath, his voice tight with anxiety. "Damn it, he's coming!" The very air around him seemed to tremble as the Soul Striker raced toward him, his speed blinding, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The ground cracked and shattered with every step the Soul Striker took, each footfall sending vibrations through the walls of the dungeon. Suho reached the gate, and without hesitation, he threw himself at the doors, his hands grasping at the cold metal. "I have to get through," he thought desperately. "If those guys were really stopping me from reaching this gate, then once the Soul Striker arrives, it'll be over." His heart hammered in his chest, and the sound of his frantic breath echoed in his ears. Just as his fingers gripped the door handles, the Soul Striker's aura hit him like a physical force, the pressure suffocating. Suho glanced over his shoulder, meeting the bloodlust radiating from the Soul Striker's eyes. "Damn it, he's here already!" With a chilling, emotionless calm, the Soul Striker began to close the distance between them, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. Suho could feel the weight of the Soul Striker's presence bearing down on him. And then, with a flash of speed, the Soul Striker lunged toward him, an unstoppable force determined to keep him from entering the gate. Suho's mind raced, his every thought scrambling to find a way to escape. The Soul Striker stretched out his arm, his reach growing longer with each step. Suho's heart dropped as the distance between them closed. He could feel the cold fingers of fate reaching for him. But just as panic began to rise in his chest, an idea sparked in his mind. "The Soul Striker can't get through the gate, right?" With a surge of energy, Suho pushed the gates open with all his strength. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to stop. As the door creaked open, he gasped for air, his mind racing with a frantic plan. "The gate will protect me," he thought. Just as the Soul Striker's hand reached the threshold, the cold aura of death almost tangible, in the final instant, Suho slammed the door shut with a force that echoed through the hallways. He stumbled back, breathless, his heart still racing from the near miss. Sweat dripped from his brow as exhaustion overtook him, but there was a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He lowered his head in disbelief, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "Finally, I escaped from those bastards." But even as he exhaled in relief, doubt began to creep back into his mind. "It's not over yet." His thought flickered to the other two versions of himself, considering them. "It's highly likely that the being here is a past version of me." The possibilities flashed through his mind. "Maybe it's when I first started the tutorial or when I carried all of the high-grade weapons." His brow furrowed in thought. But if it's either of those, then who could it be? Before he could settle his mind, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Suho instinctively turned, his eyes narrowing as he sensed a presence behind him. From the shadows, another figure emerged, slow but deliberate. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the shape, a version of himself, yet different. This version of him was more terrifying, colder. His face was as hard and unyielding as the Soul Striker's, his eyes gleaming in unnatural blue, reflecting nothing but pure bloodlust. There was no flicker of emotion, no hints of humanity. Just the chilling, empty gaze of a killer. The figure stepped fully out of the shadows, revealing two high-grade swords clenched in its hands. Power radiated from this version of Suho, overwhelming and suffocating. This was no mere reflection. This was Suho's next challenge, a twisted mirror of his own self. And it was ready for battle.